A black family is falsely accused by their racist neighbor, thrown into chaos, and then hit by a tragic accident that leaves everyone shattered. As the dust settles, shocking secrets emerge that change everything. What could be more heartbreaking than losing everything overnight? Marcus Johnson stood by the front door of his modest home, watching the crisp autumn breeze rustle the golden leaves on the trees outside. His heart swelled with a mix of pride and love as he glanced at his daughter, Lily, who sat patiently in the back seat of their car, her legs swinging back and forth as she hummed to herself. She was a bright and lively 8-year-old, with her mother's curly brown hair and his deep brown eyes, always full of curiosity. Today was Saturday, their special day. Since Marcus had become a single father after the divorce, weekends were dedicated to spending time with Lily, just the two of them. It wasn't always easy balancing work and fatherhood, but Marcus wouldn't trade these moments for anything. This weekend, they had planned a trip to the park followed by an ice cream outing, Lily's favorite. Marcus worked as a manager at a local advertising firm. His job demanded a lot of time and energy, but he made sure to prioritize Lily. Every Friday, he made sure to wrap up early so he could spend the weekend with her. She was his world, and nothing else mattered when it came to being the best dad he could be. As Marcus loaded the final bag into the trunk of their car, he noticed Greg, their neighbor, standing across the street. Greg was an older man in his mid-50s with graying hair, and he had lived next door for years. Despite being neighbors, Marcus and Greg rarely spoke. Greg was a man of few words, and when he did speak, it usually involved complaints about the neighborhood. "Hey Marcus," Greg called out, his voice carrying an edge of disapproval. Marcus turned, offering a polite nod. "Hey Greg, how's it going?" Greg eyed the car suspiciously before replying, "You know, that tree branch of yours is getting pretty close to the power lines. You might want to take care of that before it causes some real trouble." Marcus glanced at the branch, which hung slightly over the property line between their houses. It wasn't a big deal, but Greg had a habit of finding something to complain about. "I'll get to it soon," Marcus replied, knowing full well that trimming the tree was the last thing on his mind. Greg just grunted in response before turning back to his house, muttering something under his breath. Marcus sighed, shaking his head. He didn't have time for Greg's negativity today. All he cared about was giving Lily a fun and memorable afternoon. "All right, let's go," Marcus said, sliding into the driver's seat and flashing a warm smile at Lily in the rearview mirror. Lily's face lit up with excitement. "Are we getting ice cream after the park, Daddy?" Marcus chuckled, the tension of the interaction with Greg fading. "Of course we are, sprinkles and all." Lily giggled, kicking her feet in delight. Moments like these made all the stress of the week worth it. Marcus turned the key in the ignition, and the familiar hum of the car's engine filled the air. As they pulled out of the driveway, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of peace wash over him. It was just him and his daughter, and that was all he needed. The park was only a few minutes away, a quiet, peaceful spot where families often gathered. The playground was always filled with children running and laughing, while parents sat nearby, chatting or watching their little ones play. Marcus parked the car and helped Lily out of her seat, smiling as she immediately dashed toward the swings. "Push me, Daddy," Lily called out, her voice brimming with joy. Marcus followed her to the swings and gently pushed her as she soared higher and higher, her laughter filling the air. He loved seeing her so carefree. After everything they had been through with the divorce and moving to a new neighborhood, these simple moments of happiness meant the world to him. As Lily played, Marcus sat on a nearby bench, scrolling through his phone while keeping an eye on her. He had just opened an email when he noticed a familiar figure approaching. It was Officer Brad Raymond, a local police officer who often patrolled the neighborhood and the park. Raymond was tall and broad-shouldered, with a stern face that rarely softened. Marcus had seen him around, but they'd never had much interaction beyond a few polite nods. "Good afternoon, Mr. Johnson," Raymond said as he approached, his tone formal and direct. Marcus looked up, confused by the officer's serious demeanor. "Afternoon, officer. Is something wrong?" Raymond glanced around the park before fixing his gaze back on Marcus. We received a call from someone in the neighborhood. They reported that there was suspicious activity involving you and a child here. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Suspicious activity? He repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. That's my daughter, Lily. We come here every weekend. Raymond nodded, but his expression remained cold. I understand, but we still need to investigate any reports we receive. It's standard procedure. Marcus's mind raced. He knew immediately who had made the call. Greg. The man had been watching him for weeks, always casting suspicious glances whenever Marcus and Lily left the house. It wasn't the first time Marcus had felt the weight of being judged unfairly, but it still stung deeply. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. There's nothing going on here except me spending time with my daughter. I'm sure that's the case, Raymond said, though his tone suggested otherwise. But we still need to verify everything. Do you have any identification with you? Marcus's hands trembled as he reached into his pocket for his wallet. He handed over his driver's license, along with Lily's birth certificate, which he carried with him for moments like these, moments that always seemed to happen too often. Raymond examined the documents, his face impassive. After what felt like an eternity, he handed them back. Everything seems to check out, he said, though there was no apology in his voice. We just have to be thorough, you understand? Marcus nodded, though his heart ached with frustration. Yeah, I get it. Without another word, Raymond turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing there, his hands still shaking. He watched as the officer left the park, his heart heavy with the weight of the unfairness he had just endured. Looking over at Lily, who was still happily playing on the swings, oblivious to what had just happened, Marcus felt a surge of protectiveness. He didn't want her to grow up in a world where she'd have to face the same kind of suspicion and judgment he did. Daddy, Lily called out, running over to him with a bright smile. Can we get ice cream now? Marcus forced a smile, pushing the anger down. Of course, sweetheart. Let's go. As they walked back to the car, Marcus couldn't help but glance over his shoulder, half expecting to see Greg or Officer Raymond watching them. But they were alone now, just him and Lily. And as they drove off toward the ice cream shop, Marcus vowed to protect his daughter from the harsh realities of the world for as long as he could. But deep down, he knew that no matter how hard he tried, there would always be days like this, days where the world reminded him of the obstacles they faced, simply because of the color of his skin. Yet, for Lily's sake, he would keep going. The next morning, Marcus awoke early, still feeling the weight of the previous day's events hanging over him like a dark cloud. He looked over at the framed picture of him and Lily on the nightstand, their smiles bright and carefree, taken just a few months after the divorce. He sighed deeply, trying to shake off the frustration and anger that lingered from his encounter with Officer Raymond at the park. Marcus knew that incidents like yesterday were far too common in his life. Despite his hard work, despite being a devoted father and a law-abiding citizen, there was always someone who saw him as a threat. And yesterday, it had been Greg and that officer, who had embarrassed him in front of his daughter, without even an apology afterward. The weight of it all felt especially heavy that morning. As he prepared breakfast, Marcus heard Lily's small footsteps padding down the stairs. She entered the kitchen, still rubbing her eyes and yawning, her curly hair a wild mess from sleep. "Good morning, Daddy," she said with a sleepy smile, her voice soft and sweet. "Morning, Princess," Marcus replied, doing his best to sound cheerful as he poured her a glass of orange juice. "How'd you sleep?" "Good," she answered, sliding into her seat at the kitchen table. "Are we going to the park again today?" Marcus hesitated. He didn't want to admit to his daughter that he was afraid of another encounter like the one with Officer Raymond. But he didn't want to deprive her of the joy of playing outside just because of the prejudice of others. "Maybe later," Marcus said after a moment, forcing a smile. "How about we do something different today? I was thinking we could go visit Grandpa." Lily's eyes lit up at the mention of her grandfather. "Really? I love going to Grandpa's house." Marcus smiled at her enthusiasm. His father, James Johnson, was a retired schoolteacher who had always been a guiding light in Marcus's life. After his wife, Marcus's mother, had passed away, James had focused all of his energy on being there for his son and granddaughter. Despite the pain of losing his wife, James remained a strong and steady presence in their lives, always full of wisdom and comfort. After finishing breakfast and packing a small bag for Lily, Marcus loaded the car and they set off for his father's house, which was about an hour away. The drive was peaceful, the autumn colors of the trees lining the road giving a sense of calm. For a brief moment, Marcus allowed himself to forget about the stresses of the world and focus on the joy of spending time with his family. When they arrived, James was already waiting on the porch, his weathered face breaking into a wide smile as soon as he saw them. He was a tall man with broad shoulders, his graying hair and kind eyes betraying years of wisdom. Lily immediately jumped out of the car and ran toward him, her laughter filling the air. "Grandpa!" she shouted, throwing her arms around his waist. James laughed heartily, picking her up and twirling her around. "There's my girl. How are you, Lilybug?" "I'm good, Grandpa," she giggled as he set her down. "Daddy said we could come see you today." "Well, I'm glad you did," James said, smiling as he patted her head gently. Then, turning to Marcus, his face softened with concern. "How are you holding up, son?" Marcus sighed, walking up to his father. He didn't want to burden Lily with the details of what had happened at the park, but he knew he needed to talk about it with someone who understood. "I'm managing," Marcus replied, giving his father a tired smile. "But I could use a break from all the nonsense, to be honest." James nodded knowingly and motioned for them to come inside. Once they were settled in the living room, Lily immediately began playing with the old wooden toys her grandfather had saved from Marcus's childhood. Meanwhile, James offered Marcus a cup of coffee and sat down beside him. "I can tell something's been bothering you," James said, his voice gentle but firm. "What's going on?" Marcus hesitated for a moment before finally opening up about the encounter at the park. The call from Greg, the way Officer Raymond had treated him, and the frustration he felt at being judged simply because of who he was. James listened intently, his face growing serious as Marcus spoke. When Marcus finished, his father sat in silence for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "You've always been a good man, Marcus," James began, his voice steady. "But this world, it doesn't always see us that way. It's not fair and it's not right. But you've got to remember who you are. You're not defined by how others treat you." Marcus nodded, though the weight of his father's words only partially eased the ache in his chest. "I know, Dad. I just hate that Lily has to grow up in a world like this. I want to protect her, but I feel so powerless sometimes." James reached out and placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "You're doing the best you can, and that's all any of us can do. But don't let fear control you. You keep raising Lily the way you have been, with love and strength. She's going to be okay because she has you." Marcus looked over at Lily, who was happily playing on the floor, unaware of the turmoil swirling in her father's mind. He wanted so badly to believe his father's words, but there was a lingering doubt that he couldn't shake. How could he protect his daughter from the harsh realities of the world when he couldn't even protect himself? Just as he was about to respond, there was a loud knock at the door. The sudden noise startled all of them, and James frowned as he stood up to answer it. "I'll get it," he said, his voice carrying a hint of unease. Marcus watched as his father opened the door, revealing a man in a dark suit standing on the porch. The man was holding a clipboard and wore an expression that was both professional and distant. "Mr. James Johnson?" the man asked, his voice cold and formal. "Yes, that's me," James replied, his brow furrowing. "Can I help you with something?" The man cleared his throat before speaking. "I'm here on behalf of the local housing authority. We've received multiple complaints about your property from your neighbor." James's frown deepened. "Complaints? What kind of complaints?" The man glanced down at his clipboard. "The complaints range from noise disturbances to unkempt property lines. We've also been informed of some concerning behavior involving your son and granddaughter." Marcus stood up, his body tense. "What are you talking about? There's nothing wrong with this house, and we haven't done anything." The man looked at Marcus briefly before returning his gaze to James. "We'll be conducting an investigation over the next few weeks. If we find any violations, you could face penalties, or in extreme cases, even eviction." "Eviction?" Marcus echoed, his voice rising with disbelief. "This is absurd." James raised a hand to calm Marcus, though his own expression was one of shock. "We've lived here for decades," James said, his voice steady but tight. "This is our home. I've never had any issues with the housing authority before." The man nodded, though his expression remained indifferent. "I understand, sir, but we have to follow up on any reports we receive. I'll be in touch." Without waiting for a response, the man turned and walked back to his car, leaving the three of them standing in the doorway, stunned. As the car disappeared down the street, Marcus felt a surge of anger rise within him. He knew exactly where these complaints had come from: Greg. The man had been watching them, waiting for any opportunity to cause trouble, and now it seemed he had found a way to do it. "This is ridiculous," Marcus muttered under his breath, his hands clenched into fists. "He's trying to get us out of here." James sighed heavily, rubbing a hand across his forehead. "We'll figure this out, Marcus. We've been through worse." But as Marcus looked at his father, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. It wasn't just about the house, it was about something bigger. The world was closing in on them, and no matter how hard they tried to fight, it always seemed like the odds were stacked against them. He glanced down at Lily, who had stopped playing and was looking up at him with wide, worried eyes. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice small and frightened. "Are we going to lose Grandpa's house?" Marcus knelt down beside her, taking her hands in his. "No, sweetheart," he said, though his heart was heavy with uncertainty. "We're not going to let that happen." But as the weight of the situation pressed down on him, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that their struggles were far from over. The days after the visit from the housing authority passed in a blur of tension and uncertainty. Marcus had never seen his father so stressed. James was usually the calm rock in the family, the one who always found a way to make things right. But now, Marcus noticed the deep lines of worry etched into his father's face as they waited for any news about the investigation. Marcus felt restless, angry, and helpless. Every morning, he dropped Lily off at school and returned to his father's house, hoping to hear something from the housing authority that would clear their name and prove that the complaints were unfounded. But with each passing day, the silence only made the weight of uncertainty heavier. It was one afternoon, after picking Lily up from school, that things took another turn for the worse. As Marcus pulled into the driveway, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number. Hesitating for a second, he answered. "Hello, Mr. Marcus Johnson?" The voice on the other end asked. "Yes, speaking. Who is this?" "My name is Officer Daniels. I'm with Child Protective Services. I need to speak with you regarding a report we received about your daughter, Lily." Marcus's heart skipped a beat, and his grip tightened on the steering wheel. "What? A report? About Lily? What are you talking about?" The officer's tone remained professional but detached. "I'm afraid we've received a complaint that suggests there may be concerns regarding your ability to care for her. The report mentions possible neglect and unsafe living conditions." Marcus felt like the air had been sucked out of his lungs. "That's ridiculous. I take care of my daughter. There's nothing unsafe about our home." "I understand this is difficult to hear," Officer Daniels continued, his tone unrelenting. "But we are obligated to investigate every claim we receive. I'm going to need to schedule a visit to speak with you and your daughter, as well as inspect the home." Panic began to rise in Marcus's chest. Who reported this? Who would say such a thing? "I'm not at liberty to disclose that information," Officer Daniels replied. "But I'll be conducting the visit within the next 48 hours. I suggest you prepare accordingly." Before Marcus could protest further, the line went dead. He sat in the car, staring at his phone in disbelief. This had to be Greg's doing. First the housing authority, and now this? It was as if the man was determined to tear apart their lives, piece by piece. Lily, sensing her father's distress, looked at him from the back seat with concern. "Daddy, are you okay?" Marcus turned to her, his heart aching. How could he explain to his little girl what was happening? How could he protect her from this nightmare? "I'm fine, sweetie," he said, forcing a smile. "Let's go inside. Grandpa's waiting for us." Once inside, Marcus found his father in the kitchen, cleaning up from lunch. He could see the worry etched in James's face, the quiet tension that had become a constant presence in their home. "Dad," Marcus began, his voice shaking slightly, "we have another problem." James turned to his son, his brow furrowing in concern. "What happened?" Marcus explained the phone call from Child Protective Services, and as he spoke, he saw the color drain from his father's face. "They're coming to investigate? Over some bogus complaint?" James asked, his voice low and strained. Marcus nodded. "Yeah, they think Lily's in danger or something. This has Greg written all over it. First the housing authority, and now this. He's trying to destroy us." James clenched his fists, his jaw tight with anger. "That man has been nothing but trouble since the day he moved in next door. He's always had it out for us." "I don't understand why," Marcus said, pacing the kitchen. "I've never done anything to him, and neither have you. But it's like he's determined to ruin our lives." James let out a heavy sigh and rubbed his temples. "Some people don't need a reason, Marcus. They just thrive on making others suffer." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Marcus felt a mix of anger, fear, and frustration swirling inside him, threatening to consume him. How could he fight back against something so insidious, so unfair? "Dad, what are we going to do?" Marcus asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. James looked at his son, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and sorrow. "We'll do what we always do, son. We'll fight. We'll show them that we're not the people they're making us out to be." The next 48 hours felt like an eternity. Marcus spent the time preparing for the visit, cleaning the house and making sure everything was in perfect order. He even spoke to Lily, trying to explain in the simplest terms that someone was coming to ask questions about their home. He didn't want to scare her, but he needed her to understand that this was serious. Finally, the day of the visit arrived. Marcus was on edge, pacing the living room as they waited for Officer Daniels to arrive. James sat quietly at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, though Marcus could tell by the way his father kept glancing at the clock that he was just as nervous. When the doorbell rang, Marcus's heart leaped into his throat. He opened the door to find a tall man in his mid-40s, dressed in a suit, standing on the porch. Behind him was a woman, likely a social worker, holding a clipboard. "Mr. Johnson?" Officer Daniels asked. "That's me," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're here to conduct the welfare check," Daniels said, his tone formal and businesslike. "May we come in?" Marcus stepped aside, allowing them to enter the house. Lily was sitting on the couch, coloring in her favorite book, her small face lighting up when she saw the visitors. "Hi," she said cheerfully, unaware of the tension in the room. The social worker smiled warmly at her. "Hello, sweetie. What are you drawing?" "A picture of me and my daddy," Lily said proudly, holding up the drawing for the woman to see. Marcus felt a lump form in his throat as he watched the exchange. He wanted to scream that his daughter was happy and safe, that this whole investigation was a farce, but he knew he had to remain calm. Officer Daniels walked through the house, inspecting each room methodically. The social worker asked Lily a few gentle questions, trying to assess her well-being without scaring her. James stayed in the kitchen, watching from a distance with a worried expression. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Officer Daniels returned to the living room. "Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice still cool and detached, "I see no immediate concerns in the home. Everything appears to be in order." Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was quickly tempered by the officer's next words. "However, given the nature of the complaint, we will still need to conduct a follow-up interview with your daughter at a later date. It's standard procedure." Marcus's heart sank. Even though the house had passed the inspection, they weren't out of the woods yet. Fine, Marcus said, doing his best to hide his frustration. When will that be? We'll contact you in a few days to schedule it, Officer Daniels replied. For now, I suggest you continue to maintain a safe environment for your daughter. With that, the officer and the social worker left, leaving Marcus and his family in a stunned silence. James stood up from the table and walked over to his son, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You did good, Marcus, James said softly. We'll get through this. But as Marcus looked around the house, his mind raced with worry. Greg was determined to tear them down, and Marcus didn't know how much longer they could hold on. The fight wasn't over yet. If anything, it had only just begun. As the days stretched on, Marcus felt like he was living under a constant cloud of anxiety. The threat of another visit from Child Protective Services loomed over him like a shadow, and the tension in the house was palpable. James did his best to keep things light, playing with Lily and trying to distract her from the seriousness of what was happening. But Marcus could tell that even his father was struggling to stay optimistic. And then, just when Marcus thought things couldn't get any worse, they did. It was a rainy afternoon when the call came. Marcus had just finished dropping Lily off at a friend's house for a playdate, hoping to give her a bit of normalcy amid the chaos. He was sitting in the car, staring blankly at the windshield, when his phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but after everything that had happened recently, Marcus had gotten used to answering calls from numbers he didn't recognize. Hello, Marcus said, his voice weary. Mr. Johnson? This is Officer Daniels from CPS. The voice on the other end replied. Marcus felt his stomach clench. He hadn't expected to hear from Daniels again so soon. Yeah, I remember you, Marcus replied cautiously. What's going on? There was a pause on the line, and Marcus could sense that something was wrong even before Daniels spoke again. We've received another complaint, Daniels said, his voice carefully neutral. This time, it's more serious. The report suggests that your daughter, Lily, may be in immediate danger. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. What? That's insane. Lily is safe. She's happy. Who would say something like that? I can't disclose who made the report, but given the nature of the complaint, we're required to take immediate action, Daniels explained, his voice cool and detached. I'm afraid we'll need to place Lily in temporary custody while we conduct a thorough investigation. Marcus felt like the ground had fallen out from under him. His vision blurred as his mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening. You're taking my daughter away? You can't do that. There's no danger. This is all lies. I understand that this is upsetting, Daniels said, his tone almost robotic, as if he were reading from a script. But we have to follow protocol. I suggest you prepare for our arrival. We'll be there within the hour. Before Marcus could protest further, the call ended. He stared at his phone, his hands trembling, the weight of what had just been said crushing him. They were coming to take Lily, his sweet, innocent little girl, being ripped away from him because of some baseless accusation. It had to be Greg. It had to be. Marcus started the car, his mind racing. He couldn't just sit back and let this happen. He had to fight for his daughter, no matter what. But what could he do? How could he stop them from taking her? He sped home, his thoughts a chaotic mess, trying to figure out his next move. By the time he pulled into the driveway, his father was already outside, standing on the porch with a worried look on his face. James could read the panic on Marcus's face before he even spoke. Marcus, what's going on? James asked, his voice full of concern. They're coming, Marcus said, his voice breaking. They're coming to take Lily. They think she's in danger. They think I'm a danger to her. James's face turned pale, and for a moment, he looked like he might collapse. What? That's ridiculous. They can't just take her without proof. They're saying it's temporary while they investigate, but we know how these things go, Marcus said, pacing back and forth, his hands running through his hair. Greg's behind this, I know he is. He's trying to destroy us, and now they're going after Lily. James shook his head, his eyes filled with disbelief. We can't let this happen. We won't. But before they could say anything more, the sound of tires on gravel filled the air. Marcus turned to see two cars pulling into the driveway, one unmarked, the other a police car. A knot of dread tightened in his stomach. This was really happening. Officer Daniels stepped out of the unmarked car, followed by two other CPS workers, both women carrying paperwork and clipboards. From the police car, a uniformed officer emerged, his expression cold and distant. Marcus's mind screamed in panic, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't make this worse by losing control. Daniels approached with that same professional detachment, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Johnson, we're here to carry out the court order. Lily will be placed in temporary custody pending the investigation." James stepped forward, his voice filled with anger and desperation. "You have no right. There's no proof, no reason to take her. We're following procedure, sir," Daniels said, his tone unmoved by James's protest. "The safety of the child comes first." Marcus felt like he was in a nightmare, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear anything else. His father was arguing with the officer, but it all felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. His mind kept going back to Lily, his sweet, innocent girl who had no idea what was about to happen. Suddenly, Marcus saw red. He couldn't let them do this. He couldn't let them take her away. Without thinking, he stepped forward, blocking Daniels and the officers from getting any closer. "You're not taking her," Marcus said, his voice shaking with rage. "I won't let you." Daniels looked at Marcus with a cold, unreadable expression. "Mr. Johnson, I understand that this is difficult, but if you don't comply, the situation will escalate. Please step aside." "I said no," Marcus shouted, his fists clenched. He could feel his father's hand on his shoulder, trying to calm him down, but it was no use. The anger was too much. Before anyone could react, the police officer stepped forward, his hand on his holster. "Step back, sir. Now." James stepped in front of Marcus, putting himself between his son and the officer. "Don't make this worse, Marcus. Please." Marcus felt his father's words sink in, cutting through the rage, but it didn't make the pain any less. He stepped back, his heart pounding, knowing that he had no choice. He couldn't fight them, not like this. One of the CPS workers moved toward the house, where Lily had just come to the door, her innocent eyes wide with confusion. "What's happening, Daddy?" she asked, her voice small and frightened. Marcus's heart broke at the sight of her. He knelt down, pulling her into his arms, trying to hold back the tears. "It's going to be okay, baby," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Daddy's going to make this right." Lily clung to him, not understanding but sensing the fear in his voice. The CPS worker gently took her by the hand, leading her toward the car. Lily looked back at Marcus, her eyes filled with confusion and fear, and it took every ounce of strength he had not to fall apart right then and there. James stood beside him, his hand on Marcus's shoulder, silent but steady. Together, they watched as the car pulled away, taking Lily with it. As the taillights disappeared down the street, Marcus felt like the world had come crashing down around him. How had it come to this? How had his life fallen apart so quickly, so completely? James spoke quietly beside him, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll get her back, Marcus. We'll get her back." But as Marcus stared at the empty street, all he could feel was the crushing weight of helplessness. They had taken Lily, and he didn't know how to fight back. The nightmare wasn't over, it was only just beginning. The days following Lily's removal from Marcus's custody were the darkest of his life. Every morning he woke up expecting her to run into his room, her laughter filling the house. But each time he opened his eyes, the silence was deafening. The emptiness ate at him, gnawing at his heart like an unrelenting ache. He felt lost, powerless, as if his entire world had crumbled in a matter of seconds. James, always the rock of the family, tried to keep everything together. He spent hours on the phone with lawyers, pushing them to file an emergency motion to get Lily back. He met with community leaders, rallying support from those who knew Marcus and his family, trying to make noise about the injustice that had been done. But despite his best efforts, the system moved slowly, frustratingly so. Marcus, for his part, was unraveling. He couldn't focus, couldn't think clearly. All he could see was Lily's frightened face as the CPS workers led her away. The memory haunted him, replaying over and over in his mind until it was unbearable. He had to do something, anything, to get her back. One evening, about a week after Lily was taken, Marcus was sitting on the porch, staring blankly at the street. James had gone out for another meeting with their lawyer, and Marcus was alone with his thoughts. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the neighborhood, when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't recognize the number, but something compelled him to answer. "Hello," Marcus said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a voice he hadn't expected to hear. "Marcus, it's Greg." Marcus's blood ran cold. Of all the people in the world, Greg was the last person he wanted to speak to. He hadn't heard from him since the day Greg had shown up on their doorstep, spewing his racist accusations. Marcus's first instinct was to hang up, but something in Greg's voice stopped him. "What do you want?" Marcus growled, his anger barely contained. "I need to talk to you. It's important," Greg said, his voice unsteady. "I don't have anything to say to you," Marcus shot back. "You've already done enough." "I know," Greg said, his voice breaking slightly. "I know I've done some terrible things, but I swear, Marcus, you need to hear me out." Marcus was about to hang up when Greg's next words froze him in place. "It's about Lily." A knot of fear twisted in Marcus's stomach. "What about Lily?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Greg hesitated, his breathing shaky. "I didn't mean for this to happen. He paused, his words tangled with regret. "I didn't want things to get this far. I made a mistake. And now they're using her." "What the hell are you talking about, Greg?" Marcus said, his patience running thin. "Who's using her?" "Look, I can't explain everything over the phone," Greg said, his voice urgent. "But you need to meet me. There's something you need to see. Something that might help you get her back." Marcus's heart was pounding in his chest, a mix of anger and fear flooding his veins. He didn't trust Greg. Not after everything that had happened. But if there was even a chance, however slim, that Greg had information that could help him get Lily back, Marcus had to take it. "Fine," Marcus said through gritted teeth. "Where?" Greg gave him the address of a diner on the outskirts of town. "Meet me there tonight, 8 o'clock. I'll explain everything." Marcus hung up, his mind racing. He didn't know what to expect, but he had to go. If there was any hope of getting Lily back, he couldn't afford to ignore it. Later that night, Marcus pulled into the parking lot of the diner. The neon sign buzzed overhead, casting a flickering glow over the cracked asphalt. The place was nearly empty, save for a couple of trucks parked near the entrance. Marcus scanned the lot, his nerves on edge. He still didn't trust Greg, and part of him wondered if this was some kind of setup. But he had to see it through. As he stepped inside, the smell of greasy food and stale coffee hit him. The place was as run down as it looked from the outside. Cracked vinyl booths, faded wallpaper, and a few flickering fluorescent lights. Greg was sitting at a booth in the far corner, his head down, staring into a cup of coffee. Marcus walked over, his footsteps heavy with tension. Greg looked up as Marcus approached, his face pale and drawn. He looked different, tired, beaten down, like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "You've got 5 minutes," Marcus said coldly, sliding into the booth across from him. "Start talking." Greg sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I never wanted to hurt Lily. I swear, Marcus. I just wanted to mess with you, make things hard for you. But this went way beyond what I planned." "What did you plan, Greg?" Marcus demanded, his voice filled with barely contained fury. "You called CPS on me. You made my life hell. You think an apology is going to fix that?" Greg flinched at Marcus's words. "I thought if I stirred the pot, you'd lose custody, that maybe you'd move away, and things would go back to normal in the neighborhood." "Normal?" Marcus spat, shaking his head in disbelief. "Normal for you? Where you get to pretend people like me don't exist?" Greg didn't answer. He just stared at the table, guilt written all over his face. After a long pause, he finally spoke again. I didn't realize what was going on, not at first. But the people who took Lily, they're not just from CPS. There's more to this, Marcus. Something I didn't see until it was too late. Marcus leaned forward, his heart pounding. What do you mean? What's going on? Greg glanced around the diner, as if making sure no one was listening, before lowering his voice. I started noticing things, strange things. The people who came to take Lily weren't just CPS workers, they were involved in something bigger. I overheard a conversation between them and someone higher up. They mentioned something about kids, about taking them from families, from parents who wouldn't be missed. Marcus's blood ran cold. What are you saying, Greg? I'm saying there's something going on here. Something dangerous, Greg said, his voice shaking. They're targeting kids from families they think no one will fight for, and they're using CPS as a cover. Marcus felt like the world was spinning. This couldn't be real, it couldn't be happening. But the fear in Greg's eyes told him it was. This wasn't just about custody anymore. This was about something much darker. You have to believe me, Marcus, Greg pleaded. I didn't know it would go this far. I thought it was just about making your life harder. But now I don't know what they're planning. All I know is that Lily is in danger. Marcus sat back in his seat, his mind racing. Could this really be true? Could CPS be involved in something so horrific? And if they were, what did that mean for Lily? What do we do now? Marcus asked, his voice low and full of dread. Greg met his eyes, and for the first time, Marcus saw real fear in the man's face. We find out the truth, and we stop them, before it's too late. The two men sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of what they were about to uncover pressing down on them. Whatever was happening, whatever secrets were hiding in the shadows, Marcus knew one thing for sure. He would stop at nothing to protect his daughter.